Okay, so we've talked about genetics a good bit here for the last few weeks. And I have one more topic I want to talk about. So, do the genes of a population stay the same from generation to generation? Not necessarily. We talked about the fact that humans have 3 alleles for blood types, A, B, and the recessive. You only have 2 in you personally because you're diploid, but in the whole population there are 3. Does the percentage of A stay the same all the time? No, it can change over time. So that's what our topic for today. How does the percent of each of those alleles change from generation to generation? The first reason that they could change is called natural selection. This is when a phenotype is favored or not favored by the environment, causing them to reproduce more or less than they would if they had a different phenotype. So let's consider some pictures here. Grasshoppers. They can come in brown or green, and there you see them against contrasting background and blending background. And so this makes them more or less easy targets for predators like birds and snakes and small rodents and humans and things like that. So in this fictitious example, in the first generation, the parents have 80% green alleles, 20% brown alleles. And after 1 year, the parents have died and the F1, the offspring, have been born. And now they have 60% green genes and 40% brown, which means the brown, for some reason, was favored. We would expect then that the bottom left corner is what we had, a dark background with dark grasshoppers, causing them to be more fit to the environment. And so if this happened over time, we could get a shift toward more brown as opposed to less green in the long term. And that would actually be called directional selection whenever one phenotype is selected over the other. So in that directional selection image, you see a normal distribution where one end has a certain phenotype, and then we select toward that phenotype. In stabilizing selection, let's consider an example of a live-born mammal, a kitten. So stabilizing selection would select against very large and very small kittens at birth. Medium-sized kittens, the right size to be born well, would be selected for. That's called stabilizing selection, works toward the middle. So very small kittens might not survive, the runt of the litter, and very large kittens, the mother might not survive, which would make the kittens not survive, and so therefore those genes wouldn't be passed on. So a normal distribution gets selected toward the middle. That's stabilizing. Disruptive, for some reason, only the ends are selected for. So back to the grasshoppers, let's say one area, their ecosystem was very green, one was very brown, and we had different pools of organisms, green hanging out in green and brown hanging out in brown, and we would get 2 separate gene pools. Eventually, we'll talk about this another week, you might get different species because they wouldn't be able to mate with each other after a while. So here's the same thing, just these 3 again. The top row of this is the same population 3 different times. Normal distribution, most of the beetles are medium colored, some are light, some are dark. And so on the left side in the first column, this is stabilizing selection where the light and dark are selected against. The medium are more likely to reproduce for whatever reason, and we end up with most of them being medium colored. In the second column, in the middle of the picture, directional selection is going to select against light-colored ones. Maybe there's a new volcanic island where the background is very dark because of ash and rock, and the birds come along and pick off the light ones, and we end up with just mostly dark ones in that environment. And in diversifying selection, there might be 2 separate pockets in the ecosystem that would cause medium ones not to do well, but very light ones and very dark ones, and we would get 2 groups within the population. So natural selection works on phenotype, selects for the phenotype that fits in the environment better, and as a result, the alleles that cause the phenotype change over time. Genetic drift, though, is just some random, uncontrolled, unplanned, no really reason for it event, just like the word drift implies. It's just wandering around. And in this picture, we see that there are some white alleles in a population of flowers, that red is dominant over white, and then over time some things change. And this is just a random event. Like, for example, in the first picture, generation 1, 70% red, 30% white genes. Maybe a bulldozer comes in to build a house and kills more red ones, and next generation, a year later, there is 50% red genes, 50% white genes. And maybe the lady who moves into the house really likes the white flowers and she picks them all and they don't reproduce. And because of that shift, there's, in generation 3, 100% red and 0% white. And that's drift. There are a couple subtypes of drift based on how they happen. and why they happen the way they do. So a founder is someone who starts something new. So a founder's effect happens when a population leaves the original population to a new geographic location and starts a new population in a new place, and those allele frequencies might be different than the mother population because different individuals had different alleles. So consider this pedigree. Here we have a couple and they have 4 children, and then by their grandchildren generation, we start to see cousin marriages. So this original couple actually was a founder for this family because some of these people can trace their lineage back to that same couple 4 or 5 different ways. And so this particular trait is a lethal recessive, meaning the person who gets the homozygous recessive phenotype dies from it. And we could assume from this pedigree that one of the original founders had this recessive allele, making it 25% frequency in them. And as their children had cousin marriages after generations, and we looked at that earlier this last week, that in royal families, this caused a problem after several generations. And after 5, we see a lot of the great-great-great-grandchildren dying of this recessive trait because the founders had this gene. Here's a simplified version of this. On the mainland, you have a population of beetles. Some are yellow, some are red. One of the beetles blows to the island. Turns out it's a female who's gravid. That means that she's already fertilized her eggs and she's ready to lay eggs that'll hatch. And they're all going to hatch out red. And on the island, only the red gene happens. Is there a reason for that? No. It's just random genetic drift. It could have just as likely been a yellow one that got blown off to the new island, but it was a red one, so there's only red. A slightly different form of genetic drift is a bottleneck. At the beginning of a bottle, it's narrow and not all the liquid comes out at once. And so this term means that only a few individuals survive a near extinction. So there was a big population and almost all of them died. And the few that made it through the bottleneck of near extinction get to reproduce in the same geographic location. So it's different than founder's effect in the fact that it's the same place that it started out, but only a few individuals start a new population in that place. And the genes can be in different percentages than the original population. What you're looking at here is a picture of bison skulls. You may recall that after the railroad was completed across the plains in the Midwest of the United States, herds crossed the railroad tracks. People got bored, so they started shooting the bison, leaving them lie. And this picture was taken about 100 years ago. Somebody said, bone is a good fertilizer, so let's gather up all those skulls and grind them up and sell them for fertilizer. And that's what's going on in this picture. And even before that, we had pushed bison to much lower populations. You may not realize that they lived in Perry County too, but if you think about the fact there's a Buffalo Township, Little Buffalo Creek, Big Buffalo Creek, Little Buffalo State Park, Newport's mascot is the bison. There's a town called New Buffalo in Perry County. So we had bison here. The last ones were recorded to be killed on December 31st, 1799 in what's now Union County. And so we've been pushing the genetic frequency distribution to a smaller and smaller group for a long time. And now the ones that exist may or may not have the same alleles that the original had. We don't even know if the eastern bison was a separate subspecies, maybe had very different alleles than the western plains bison. And those alleles are gone now. So that's a bottleneck. This has happened with cheetahs and some other organisms. So the end result of natural selection and genetic drift, both, whether it's because of phenotypes or not, which is the difference between the two, is that different phenotypes in the population become more or less common over time. So in this example, this is a genetic drift. There's no reason for it. 17% of the population was green, and in 3 generations, it's 44%. Here we have another genetic drift. We think that blue eyes originated as a mutation of the eye color allele in Turkey, which is in the bottom right, pointing toward Greece and then Italy. And in Turkey, 20 to 49% of the population has blue-colored eyes. And in this region of the world, it doesn't offer a great advantage to have that. Closer to the equator, it does offer some protection against cancer. But in Northern Europe, none whatsoever. And so it was just a random thing that blue eyes became very common in the region around the Baltic Sea, as you see, where 80% of the Moor population has it. This is genetic drift. I want to leave you with one example yet. This is artificial. This is not natural selection. This is artificial selection. So here in a couple of weeks, some of the fields will have a yellow flowered weed growing in them, wild mustard. It's one of the early spring flowers in Perry County. And so that plant has been selected by humans for different allele frequencies, either for big leaves or small leaves or tight leaves or loose leaves or flowering or not flowering or thick stems or not thick stems, to produce these vegetables. You may or may not eat these vegetables, but they're actually all the same plant. They're just different subpopulations within that same species that have been selected to have different allele percentages. And so based on which genes are common in that subgroup, we get these different phenotypes that we call different things. And so if you've ever eaten these vegetables, they all have a faintly similar taste to them because they're actually all the same plant. So hopefully that wasn't too boring. Tried to get through that quickly. We're going to have office hours next week, and I'll answer questions if you have them. So if you have any questions, just jot them down or make notes on the slides that I'm going to put in classroom. So hopefully you're still awake, and that is the end.